A very warm welcome to the third episode of the WWEA podcast, The World of Wind Power. After we spoke in the previous episodes about the global situation and the largest Latin American market, Brazil, we will today look into Africa, in particular North Africa. And it's my great pleasure to have as our guest Mr. Khalid Benhamou from Morocco, from Sahara Wind, who works from Morocco, but he's very knowledgeable, of course, not only in North Africa, he knows also the global developments and can give us first-hand insights from his perspective, working for a company called Sahara Wind. But Khalid, a warm welcome, and maybe you can introduce yourself and tell us a little bit how you've come to wind power, working for the company and what the company is doing.
Thank you very much, Stefan. It's a pleasure to be able to participate in this exciting series, which I believe sheds some lights on what has happened to what we actually never thought would be an energy transition some 30 years ago. And it looks like we're heading there. And this is basically when I started wind energy on the Sahara coastline in an isolated site where I was exposed to a significant, huge planetary wind resource, namely the trade winds, that were intersecting with the very 2,000-kilometer long desert coast. And so I realized that local value-added applications of wind energy, because of the low cost of generation, could be tremendous for economic development for the region, and also obviously for generating green electrons that could be fed not only national-wise in Morocco, but also that could spread beyond. And we've seen later how the market evolved and the technology as well, with the ever-dropping cost of wind energy. And basically what has happened is I was very concerned coming up with an idea that I managed to present at the highest level of state, saying this is a strategic resource, this is massive, and we can basically anchor Morocco's development around renewables, particularly wind, considering the resource. And basically this approach led me to set up a pilot project, small one, to try to identify what kind of usage can be done locally with wind energy, and then explore what could be done because of massive amounts of wind energy and low power loads to supply locally, see what can be done to harness this wind energy, feed it into a regional grid, and then look at a macro scale. If you have such a large energy system going, and we're talking here about 94, 90, before the year 2000s, I was in discussions with the European Commission. And so the idea was to see, what kind of synergies could be built. And interestingly enough, the main synergy that also occurred beyond green electrons to regional markets was obviously the production of green ammonia, of which Morocco is one of the first importers. Why? Because Morocco, because of the trade winds and their paleontological footprints determining the currents over the Atlantic over millions of years, Morocco disposes now of about 70% of the world phosphate reserves, 90% of which are used as fertilizer. But for fertilizer, you need also the famous NPK formula. You need the ammonia and nitrogen, which then makes Morocco one of the main importers of gray ammonia. And then you have an opportunity then to use green hydrogen to produce green ammonia, to integrate it into a world fertilizer business, of which Morocco is the main player. And if you have that, then you can connect that as well to an energy transmission infrastructure, enabling actually the load centers of Morocco that are located some 1,300 kilometers away from the wind-blown Sahara coastline to access very cheap green electrons, and then you fit into the European decarbonization strategies. Morocco has become, in the meantime, very successful manufacturing hub for automobile, for aeronautics, and various industries. And so with the carbon abatement strategy of Europe that will kick in 2026, it's essential for Morocco's industry to dispose of cheap green electricity. 80% of the production of Morocco's automobiles are exported to Europe. And we want to make sure that these automobiles will be produced with not only green electricity, but also green steel. And so we were very early on involved as well in Mauritania in developing the first green hydrogen projects, looking into how that country's main export commodity, mainly iron ore, could be gradually transformed into green steel. So I think a month and a half ago, European Commissioner, the head of the European Commission with a couple of heads of states went to Mauritania to make a case. And so I've had the privilege to kick in wind energy in 94 and green hydrogen in 2005 in Morocco and Mauritania with support of NATO for the latter part, doing regional wind measurements. So I've had the privilege to be a little bit ahead of the curve and get involved as well in the green hydrogen strategy of Morocco and the green strategy of Morocco as well, of which wind energy really represents the bulk and has always represented the bulk of what can be successfully achieved because of the massive availability of wind.
So you said you started, so you've already described very well now what is the economic, I'd say macroeconomic benefits or the prospects for your home country, Morocco. We later look into the other North African markets as well. But 1994, I mean, I was at that time a student at university, just starting to understand a little bit renewables could be, but not really yet fully understanding the potential. And in Morocco, I don't think you had many windmills at that time. What made you understand that there's such a big potential in wind energy? How did you come across this? Because it was not really in no country nowhere played a major role yet.
Well, that's a good question, Stefan. While you were a student, probably in Germany, I actually graduated a couple of years earlier, in 92, in California from an engineering school. And if you look at the wind energy business overall, we know it was Danish run, and the main market for Danish wind turbines in the 80s and 90s, early 90s at least, was the California rush.
That was California.
And I looked at the statistics because I had to prepare my report and say, okay, this is the main topic. And I realized that 75% of the world's installed wind capacity of 1990 was 2 gigawatts, 75% of which was operational in California.
Was in California. We all remember those pictures of the early wind farms close to also where Paul Guy lives, one of the really first also activists in that area. That, of course, makes us understand, and I think that goes back at the end of the day to even Jimmy Carter, who started those programs. But now let's look into the region. I think that's a very interesting kind of connection. Now, looking at the region today, now we are looking at Morocco. Morocco is today a major market, but we're looking into the Maghreb region, also Algeria, and there's also some activities, Tunisia, but up to Libya and then Egypt. What's happened there? I personally remember that even when I was on holiday, in Egypt in the mid-90s, there were the first wind turbines there. So how did the technology then itself reach the region?
Okay, it's basically Egypt. While I set up a pilot project in Morocco, because of the area it was located, the logistics was fairly difficult. And Egypt had the privilege of having a corridor by Zafarana, which was a very good wind resource. And so they set up fairly rapidly a cooperation with Denmark to set up the Zafarana wind farm. And they were always a little bit, a couple of 100 megawatts ahead of us. And they developed their industry based on multiple concessionary sources of financing with wind turbine installed in Zafarana. And so when you looked at the statistics for North Africa, Egypt was always a little bit ahead of Morocco, which was still searching for a model. So I'll go back to Morocco later because we tried to get the private sector involved in it, which is not the case of Egypt initially. Now it is. So we experimented several approaches to developing large-scale wind. While in Egypt, you kept having concessionary finance build different wind farms. And I think Egypt was always ahead of the curve until I think a couple of years ago, where actually Morocco surpassed Egypt in terms of installed capacity.
According to the statistics that I have, it was actually last year. So my congratulations for being the first #1 country now to Morocco in North Africa.
Thank you. And in fact, so the future now, it's all under discussion because Morocco is building energy transmission infrastructure, and Egypt is also scaling up with massive investment. So Egypt has about 1,650 megawatt, 1.6 gigawatt of wind, compared to 2.3 gigawatt in Morocco. But Egypt has signed this year and the previous year several agreements with Aqua Power for 1.1 gigawatt, also Orascom Toyota NG for 3 gigawatts. So those are, they're like 4 or 5 gigawatt in the pipe, but we don't know how fast this will be implemented. And so that's the situation in Egypt. But let's not forget the global perspective of Africa with another country, which is actually, and we have to make do with the scale of its economy, which is South Africa, which has about 3.5 gigawatts of operational wind capacity. But that represents only 5% of that country's total installed capacity. And we know that South Africa is a major coal producer. So it is difficult to have visibility on how fast South Africa will deploy wind compared to both Egypt and Morocco, which probably the synergies of wind and the benefits of wind energy are much more obvious, because in the case of Egypt, it will be saving some natural gas because the mix is very, very good. And that is also the case, actually, for Algeria, that has very limited capacity of wind, about 10 megawatt, and is Africa's first natural gas exporter. And it has a grid with 98% gas-fired power generation. And in fact, generating electricity in Algeria consumes about half the country's potential export of natural gas. So while Algeria is not banking on wind, it is trying now to scale up solar capacity with the programs that have been announced. For now, it's about 1 gigawatt, 2 gigawatts modules. We don't know how fast this will be implemented. We've been waiting for a long time for something to happen with renewables in Algeria. But we wish that that country would really leverage its huge solar potential to try and save some gas, which is a precious revenue for that country. Tunisia has also an interesting case. It has about 0.2 gigawatt operational for like 10 years already from the same manufacturer, which does not exist anymore, made. And it has not managed to kick wind energy as much as it wished. Solar energy plants are also being sluggish to kick in. It has an objective of 1 gigawatt for 2030, but that objective has been announced already 7 years ago and is not implemented yet. In Nigeria, it's pretty much also the same case. It's been announced a while ago. They're like announcements, and we don't know how fast these announcements will be implemented on the ground. And if we looked at the last country that I'd like to cover in the region, which is Mauritania, a very interesting case because Mauritania is obviously a 3 million country inhabitants, so cannot be compared to Egypt's over 100 million and Morocco's 36 million people. But it has an 800 megawatt grid totally of installed capacity, in which they have recently unveiled and made operational the Boule Noir wind farm of 100 megawatt. So they're at 130 megawatts of wind, but they have very interesting prospects that I have mentioned earlier with the green hydrogen developments, which are being unfolded in parallel also with Morocco. And you have two different models for rolling out green hydrogen. And I'd be happy to dive into these two plans and see how these can contribute to the energy transition.
I think that's a very good overview first, and let's go into depth in some cases. For many years, Egypt was the leader in the region, but also the African continent as well. That is now with South Africa, when we look at Africa as such. But even North Africa, Morocco has just bypassed, but still Morocco and Egypt are the two big wind power countries in North Africa. And then you mentioned also Tunisia and Mauritania, which have also substantial installations. You've also mentioned that there is a substantial interest, and there are ambitious plans. You mentioned Egypt, I think Morocco as well. But first, maybe let's have a look at the overall landscape in the region, because what comes into my mind is that some of the countries, they have tremendous fossil resources. You talked about Algeria with gas. There is Libya with a lot of oil. Egypt has some, but I think that's not enough to cover a very dynamically growing population in the country with a high need to have more electricity. Morocco also a growing country. So how is that related, the interest and the actual investment and the availability of fossil resources, which some countries may still want to sell for many decades?
Well, that's the name of the game. Huh? That's the fundamental difference that Morocco has with the rest of the countries in the region. Namely, Morocco does not dispose of fossil resources per se. So Morocco is about 90-some% energy dependence on fossil fuel energy imports. But so therefore the strategy of Morocco is to try to reduce this dependency on fossil fuels by building a strategy that will enable energy industry transfer into renewable, mainly wind energy manufacturing components. And so, for example, Morocco has already an installed capacity of renewables that exceeds 40%. It has set a target of 52% by 2030, which will be exceeded because of the various plans that are unfolding. And Morocco has already had blade manufacturing facilities by Siemens in Tangier, which was 80% dedicated to exports. The plant has closed down because of Siemens global issues, logistics, supply chains. And one interesting development in Morocco, so just Morocco's 2.4 gigawatt of wind represents, we have a total installed capacity of about 1,100. So we're about 20% wind per se.
11,000 probably. 11,000 gigawatt then.
11,000 megawatt. So 11 gigawatt, 2.4 gigawatt. So it's about 20% wind. and it's probably the highest in the region already. We already have solar thermal as well. We have some PV. So solar thermal is a heritage from the Desertec project. So we've had some setbacks with the solar thermal plants. Some issues on one of the towers emerged recently with Aqua Power having leaks in the salt warm storage compartment, which will stop this 150 megawatt plant until the month of November, till they build a new tank. So, but for Morocco, it was important. The problem with wind, as with solar, was the intermittence. And Morocco, to try to tackle this intermittence, has used its royalties from natural gas coming from Algeria being exported to Spain. So we set up a couple of gas-fired power plants, combined cycled, some of them combined with the solar thermal, by the way, by Ibn Hattar, so interesting combinations. And that powered about 15% of Morocco's electricity. That is before Algeria decided pretty much unilaterally to just shut one pipeline because it was going through Morocco. And so they used another pipeline to penalize Morocco. So Morocco had to struggle, obviously, with the large capacity of coal-fired power plants that we had to have. And now we are importing actually natural gas on global LNG markets to Spain and feed it back through that pipeline in the reverse pumping to power our plants. But in the meantime, there are other projects coming up, namely a very exciting one, which is the Nigeria-Europe via Morocco pipeline, which will enable, it's a very long infrastructure, but it's an offshore pipeline going all offshore West Africa. And so it will enable all the countries from Nigeria all the way to Morocco to have access to natural gas. These countries like Mauritania, Senegal, Ivory Coast, Ghana are already discovering natural gas offshore. And so the idea is to have a regional distribution network enabling these countries, which make actually the bulk of the 600 million of the people in Africa that don't have access to electricity, to access at least a source of natural gas and to be able to provide an alternative to the intermittency of renewables into their grids. So it is not the panacea, it's not a solution, natural gas, obviously, but we know that the mix with renewables and natural gas is very good, as you can see with Germany that has managed to reduce.
Well, that is a quite controversial one because there's a lot of biogas in Germany, which could very well be sufficient to balance that wind and solar fluctuations. But let's better stay in the region. And I mean, what we can hear very clearly is the situation is actually, in that sense, not so different because Europe learned a lot the last 2-3 years because the dependence on Russia, and then suddenly there was no more or not much more gas bought from Russia. Other countries, like for example, Pakistan, suffered a lot because suddenly the Europeans bought all the LNG gas on the world market and there was no more gas for not so wealthy countries available. So there's a strong argument. Indeed, I do understand that point, of course, immediately why Morocco in particular, but maybe also other countries in that region, which with excellent wind resources, I think these are the world-class top, together with the north of Brazil, which is not so far. I mean, if you look at other distances. So excellent wind resources. So you can produce wind power at a very low cost. And still the share in the region is still below several European countries. So when you talk about 20% of the installed capacity, several European countries have more than 20% of the produced electricity. What are at the moment the barriers that are still taking that up? I also see in Morocco there's a strong need to have more electricity, not only because of the population, but also of the industrial activities. So what are at the moment the challenges that Morocco and other countries are facing?
There are two challenges. The first one is a transmission challenge. The main potential of Morocco, the 2.4 gigawatts To give you an example, 2.4 gigawatt of installed capacity of Morocco, 1.4 essentially is operational on the Sahara coastline, which is 1,200 kilometers away from the load centers.
Okay.
Now, the utility of Morocco is building a 3 gigawatt line. We don't know whether it will be HVDC or high AC network, high voltage AC network, to be able to send these electrons to the load centers. So that will be operational, at least half of it in 2026, and 2028 will be at least 3 gigawatts. There is a possibility to increase it to 6 gigawatts on the same corridor. This is what I've been advocating, because the Sahara Wind project, this is a network from the south of Morocco to Casablanca. The Sahara Wind project is 5 to 10 gigawatts delivered regionally to Tangier, part of it to Europe, and the other part to the northern part of Morocco, which is where all the manufacturing hubs are located. So those are two complementary infrastructures. And the other challenge for Morocco from the very beginning was to set up a wind industry. And so the idea that Morocco had, instead of relying on concessionary finance to build wind farms from every country that would provide financing and having a variety of different manufacturers, the strategy of Morocco was to pool at least 1 gigawatt. That was 10 years ago, pretty much more. It was announced in 2011, so that we could then transfer blade manufacturing plants, nacelles, towers. And so the strategy of Morocco was more focused on an integrated approach. And the latest development in that regard are fairly interesting, because while the Siemens plant has closed, we have Aeocon, a Chinese wind manufacturer, that has now built a plant in the north of Morocco. Instead of 700 jobs of Siemens, their plant is 3,000 plus jobs. It's a 320 million euro investment on manufacturing blades directly in the harbor. So it's a regional manufacturing hub, which will then enable Morocco to dispose of a manufacturing hub for wind turbine components. And the other interesting approach, beside the hydrogen, which we still have not covered, and Morocco's offer that was unveiled on March 11th, with storage also to Europe. We'll discuss that later if you give me the opportunity. But the most interesting approach we have also with wind, you know that Morocco is suffering from the 6th consecutive year of drought. And Morocco has now a massive desalination strategy for supplying both cities and agriculture. It's already the case in Agadir, where renewable energies are used to desalinate. Water is easy to store, so you don't have as much an intermittency issue as you would have for an electricity grid. And you supply then agricultural operation. And this is the case in Dakhla on the Sahara coastline, where there is a Chinese manufacturer, Envision, that has a 60 megawatt facility that will supply desalination plant for 5,000 hectares, already dispatched into small lots to be able to generate support agricultural entrepreneurs to make what I consider is sustainable agriculture, because regardless of climate change, the wind is blowing, it's carbon free, and you're not relying on drought cycle, and which are more and more constraining. So where I'm getting at is that you have then an integrated approach with wind in the manufacturing sector, in the agriculture, and obviously in Morocco's largest also industry, which is the fertilizer business, which will enable Morocco to produce green fertilizers and feed them into regional markets. In doing so, and I'll then open up a little bit on the green hydrogen strategy of Morocco, you will be able to then provide an offer, which is an integrated offer that has actually investment incentives, that has infrastructure already integrated in it, with seasonal storage in salt domes, deep salt domes by Essaouira. So basically, you'd be able to generate green hydrogen on the Sahara coastline, feed it through a pipeline, store it. You generate more wind and solar in the summertime, but we know that the market of green hydrogen, unlike natural gas, is higher in the wintertime. So with these storage facilities, you first of all will enable local value-added processing of that hydrogen in the fertilizer business, amongst other things, in the automobile sector, etc. And then you'd be able to export that green hydrogen at premium prices when the market needs it most. And so this is a unique competitive advantage that Morocco disposes of, because instead of shipping green ammonia from Chile and various other regions in the world, Morocco will be able to ship pressurized green hydrogen in pipelines that will be stored and delivered on demand to European customers, just like natural gas. So that's a revolution, because we can produce green hydrogen at competitive costs.
Let's look into this a little bit later again, a little more in depth. First, I think it's very interesting what you say about the grid infrastructure, because you're explaining now that there is a lot of investment now done in grid infrastructure. And I remember, of course, and we had like 10, 15 years ago, we had the discussion of Desertec connecting grid, European and North Africa. Obviously, the technical conditions at that time, it wasn't there yet. And I think it's probably everybody welcomes that we're connecting each other, and because that helps stabilize the grids everywhere. But one question I have in this regard is, you mentioned larger wind farms and the maybe even DC, that means high voltage direct currency connections. Distributed wind, is that also playing a role to, for example, to electrify rural areas in Morocco? Is that something that's already taking place? How is the situation in that?
Yes, definitely. Morocco has very early on had a strategic vision for the development of its wind sector. And so very early on, Morocco recognized the potential it could have because of the remoteness of the sites where wind is generated, the small size of the Moroccan grid, and the scale of the DC connections, HVDC infrastructure. We know that these infrastructure are gigawatt size, the largest being about 12 gigawatt in China, for over 3,600 kilometers long. So this is not something that Morocco can absorb into its grid. So the idea was to look at the regional dispatch. And the argument, and I'm very familiar with this argument, because very early on, when you say we're going to export electricity to Europe, the first question was, does your population have access to electricity? And back then, the numbers were not very good. Villages did not have access to electricity, many 20,000, 25,000 villages. We were developing them at the rate of connecting about 200-300 villages a year. So this was not sustainable. So Morocco has embarked into a very ambitious rural electrification program, which it completed about 10 years ago, that is now covering, I think, 99.4% of the rural electrification. Most of it grid connected, some of it distributed, but at least access to electricity in Morocco, the country has made significant efforts for both obvious social reasons, but also for a strategic purpose, so that this argument cannot be used against it, because it makes total sense to make sure that the population will have access to electricity as an imperative.
Yeah, that's a great achievement. And then it's a very good, not only side effect, but I think an impact, which I always saw when we talked about having large-scale investment in renewable energy in Northern Africa in general, that's primarily for the people in Northern Africa, that they can really have better access and availability in those countries also, which do not have fossil resources. I find also interesting, and let me just a small comment on that you say that the Chinese manufacturers are now replacing the Europeans, Siemens giving up its factory, which always there coming complaints at the moment from Europe that Chinese are taking over. But I think that's then again a European homemade issue if they just leave the country. But I think it is for Morocco again a positive move that there is then again value added in the region where you have the jobs as you just highlighted. Let's go back to the hydrogen discussion, but I think this is very interesting one. Now I'm living in Germany and there's a lot of talk importing hydrogen. So every week almost we hear governments, not only from Germany, also other European countries, are going to import and making agreements with Canada, with Norway, with Iceland, with Australia, with Namibia, Morocco. So it's a quite, for me, not so easy to understand what will this lead to. I know that Germany can also cover its own energy needs, but there can be some interesting contributions. How do you see is Morocco's position there? Of course, there's plenty of land, there's excellent wind resources, but the infrastructure is not yet there. Is there a risk that this becomes like what Desertec 15 years? Is it kind of just an empty vision? Or is that something where you expect, and I think this is just an assessment that we can both make there, because there is not yet shipping of hydrogen around the world. How do you see this realistically?
Yeah, green hydrogen, let's put it this way. There is obviously about 70 million tons of hydrogen that are being used worldwide. Mostly, I think, mostly for ammonia, and some of it for the refining industry. Some of it is produced locally, 98% from fossil fuels. So that's the current picture of the hydrogen industry. Now, Morocco has, as an advantage, been involved in green hydrogen, and I'm well placed to discuss that very early on. And so I don't think that, unlike Desertec, where you could have a competing competition of ideas, we were before Desertec, and then we were kicked out of Desertec because Desertec wanted to own the whole idea. And our approach was to say, no, this is for Morocco. We have a strategic approach. And so Morocco was influenced in the solar thermal, etc. Strategy, which is now being obviously being questioned. And it was made mostly because of the storage, because the dispatchable nature of thermal solar versus PV, and the small grid that was not capable of handling intermittency. And so the idea with the green hydrogen strategy of Morocco is, first of all, to shed the risk and have a plan that can be adapted, adjusted to how the market responds. So right now, if you have a market, which you do not yet have, then Morocco has a framework. We have plenty of investors that like to invest in hydrogen. And so we set up a framework where you can have a follow-up, land attribution with contracts, results-oriented, industrial integration. So Morocco will use actually its phosphate fertilizer manufacturing industry to set up a strategy. But for now, it relies on pilot projects to learn from the pilot projects and to see whether there will be a market, whether the prices will be guaranteed, because the scale of the investments, the massive scale of the investments into green hydrogen and green ammonia are huge. I mean, to give you an example, Morocco managed with about $1 billion investment to invest in a harbor and automobile manufacturing hub, which is now the first foreign income revenue of the country, which employs, thousands of employees and generates huge value. In the case of hydrogen, you take just the plan of the Moroccan phosphate fertilizer business. It has set up a strategy to produce about 1 million ton green ammonia by 2027. That's like 3 years. Probably not going to be met by those deadlines, but it requires an investment of about $8 billion. So Morocco does not dispose of these huge amounts of revenues for actually substituting one of the imports of fertilizer manufacturing. And so the idea for Morocco is to have a framework waiting for price signals, waiting for support from whoever would like to green it, to dispose of this product. Because in the fertilizer business, Morocco is the market maker. If Morocco makes the transition, then the whole fertilizer business, which is the bulk of the green hydrogen potential, which is production of ammonia, Morocco can make this move. And if it can make this move, it can also then deploy, as I had mentioned, those pipeline infrastructures, which will enable to bypass the ammonia route, because if you transform green hydrogen in ammonia, ship it, transform it back into green hydrogen, your prices of hydrogen double. If you have pressurized hydrogen, then you are at half price in the market, delivered on demand. So where I'm getting at is Morocco's strategy is very careful, making sure you have a framework where you have an investment framework where you can check what are the investors doing, are they delivering? Because let's face it, we had the Green Hydrogen Summit in Marrakesh that was about a week after the earthquake. It was maintained. And you had companies that says, I have 100 gigawatts of green hydrogen projects all over the world. None of them are bankable. So we can continue to discuss like that. There is a need for green hydrogen in Morocco, but there is no financing. And so Morocco has set up a framework and is basically on a wait and see mode, making sure that whoever gets involved can be tracked and that the infrastructure that is required can be planned according to the signals of the market.
Yeah, I think that's makes a lot of sense for me, because I think this market is really very dynamic. Nobody knows whether it will just start to explode one day or what will happen. This is extremely interesting to hear from you, but we're running out of time a little bit. I would like to ask you, as the final question of this podcast, you explained the situation very well. What is your vision? Now, let me put it like that. I see that at the moment, Morocco is still importing from other countries some energy resources. When do you expect will be that point reached, which I think will be beneficial anyway, and can be reached without the development on the world markets? When will be that point reached that Morocco can satisfy its own energy needs? And after that, do you expect Morocco to be an energy exporter? And I guess that the answer to the second question is yes, but please.
You get a double challenge, and this is why hydrogen comes into question. The problem of exporting green electrons is very sensitive for European markets, because they have their own domestic green electron markets, their own renewable markets. And so while you have some initiatives like the X-Links project, which aims at delivering 3.6 gigawatt of green electricity, mostly wind, fed to the UK via 3,600 kilometer sea cable, perhaps also connected to Germany. Politically, it's very difficult for a country to rely on another country for green electrons. And they have their own utilities, they have their own structures that like to own their assets or to have their assets operational locally. So with the green hydrogen approach, it's a different ballgame. It's an energy transition, it's for deep decarbonization. So there is a political objective, and the name of the game is the price. And so if you can make that transition at low cost or zero net added cost, then it's a win-win for everybody. And that's where Morocco tried to position itself. So because of the two challenges, namely the green electrons are available but are not yet accepted by European countries, and because Morocco cannot absorb the transfer of massive amounts of green electrons into its small grid, you have to have regional exchanges. Morocco is connected with Spain. We have sometimes positive, sometimes negative trade electricity balance, representing at some point 20% of Morocco's consumption and exports also. but it remains, those connections are being expanded, both on the Spanish side, on the Portuguese side, and perhaps on the UK side. There are like various different initiatives and projects that, including Sahara Wind, that aim to feed these green electrons connected to massive investments also in green hydrogen. So they're like complementary approaches. But with these two legs, if you want, of that energy strategy, Morocco will be able to access massive amounts of green electrons, very cheap, into its load center, and process its main industries, namely the fertilizer, etc. But again, the scale of the investments are massive, and for that you need a very close cooperation with the European Union and with regional players. And if there is a delay in that process, the fact that Chinese manufacturers come and set up wind turbine plants, blade factories, etc., I think must be seen in a complementary way. If things are not moving, to give you an idea of the desalination project, it was supposed to be manufactured by Siemens Gamesa, but then the price of wind turbine went up, and because the project was already attributed, the developers had to find a solution. So they say, okay, with Chinese wind turbines, we can maintain that price, and it's for local desalination, agriculture, etc. So it's a non-brainer. You cannot say, no, we have to work with Europeans because in the future, they will be our market. So no, it's an open market. We have to make sure we address global issues. And I don't think that the global energy transition will be addressed without China. And I think their involvement in that particular case would be complementary to other initiatives, which I hope will be accelerated as a result.
So you've mentioned now some important factors that play a role, how and when the situation will develop. But the one simple question you haven't yet answered, that's when do you expect Morocco will be self-sufficient with renewable energy as a next important step towards becoming an exporter?
We have very ambitious targets for 2030. The 54%, 52% will be exceeded, that's for sure, of installed capacity in renewables. The infrastructure of the 3 gigawatt infrastructure will contribute to that. There will be probably other projects in transmission infrastructure, but keep in mind that you're also tied with the vested assets that provide baseload, such as coal-fired power plants. These run until 2040, sometimes 2045. So it's a mix. But in that mix, do not exclude the fact that Morocco can export green electrons and make sure that its grid can be continuously fed by electricity, lowering its carbon footprint gradually. So it's an ongoing process, and it emulates a little bit what is likely to happen also with the green electron versus green molecule issues. It will be an ongoing process, and in that process, what is critical are the policy signals, are the support from not only Morocco, because the investment scale goes beyond Morocco. So we need to make sure that the carbon adjustment mechanism, which will contribute to investment into greening Morocco's industry, can be complemented by further European initiatives, such as the Green Hydrogen Bank, enabling prices. So it's a hot debate in Europe because Europe wants to produce its own hydrogen versus import. So these are all discussions that will go concurrently with the issue of decarbonization, climate change. So it's we have to make sure we have consistent approaches, multifaceted, and that they're constructive, and this is pretty much the case. You have
the answer to my question is obviously there's no official target, and you don't see the point that there is Morocco is coming at the moment, or it's not visible that Morocco
if I would
is
tell you
with 100% renewables. But that is also, I think, an interesting approach and an important statement. Yeah, maybe a final sentence from your side, so that we can conclude now. Your vision of Morocco is, in energy terms, that in the year 2050, Morocco is?
Yes. Morocco will be, for sure, a large energy exporting, renewable energy exporting country by 2050. Let me just, in conclusion, say that from the very beginning, I got support, financial support from NATO, because I looked at the energy transition issue into a geopolitical dimension. And energy dependency of Europe back then was extremely high vis-a-vis, obviously, Russia. And diversification of sources was a strategic security, energy security related issue. And so as the war is ongoing in the Ukraine and Russia, we don't have visibility into how that will develop. And so in that framework, it's a very conducive framework to try to accelerate, just like it has been the case in Germany, the energy transition, the massive deployment of renewables. Obviously, Germany has now a majority of renewables in its grid, which is great, welcomed. And so in that prospects, I think that Morocco is well placed to continue being a reliable, trusted partner for the energy transition, for trying to provide as much green electricity in the form of molecules or electrons as possible into a decarbonized world, which we hope will affect not only Europe, North Africa, but also the rest of Africa, as I had mentioned to you, stretching all the way to Nigeria. So because the pipelines are interesting, because the right of way of the gas pipeline onshore for Morocco is being expanded to have a green hydrogen pipeline along the way. So those are complementary plans, which will add tremendous amounts of energy security and decarbonization for many, I mean, we're talking dozens of countries in Africa and in Europe as well. That will be my conclusion.
Thank you very much, Khalid. I think this is a big picture that you're again drawing at the end of our podcast. A very interesting vision, and let's see. I think Morocco is definitely on a good way. With this, thank you very much to our audience. I think this was another very insightful episode, and I'd say goodbye. Already indicating that the next episode will be recorded at the Arena Assembly in Abu Dhabi, where I will be together with several of our board members. So the next episode will again cover a global perspective. With this, thank you, goodbye, and again, thank you very much, Khalid.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you, everybody.